Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining this guest lecture today. This is part of the course Asking Those Who Feel It, Local and Indigenous Knowledge on Climate Change. And in this course, we explore the role of local and indigenous knowledge on tackling the climate crisis, and especially how to introduce this knowledge well into science. And this course is part of global awareness education, which again is part of the transdisciplinary course program at the University of Tübingen, which is open to students from all disciplines. And my name is Inka Koch, and I hand over to Jakob Steiner to introduce our speaker today.
Thank you, Inka, and welcome, Anna. Thanks so much for making time to speak to us today, or to the whole class today. So Anna is a PhD candidate at the University of Ottawa, in political science, with a focus on research in Nunavut, so in the Arctic Canada, which is something that we have been discussing in this course now already. So that's our interest in indigenous knowledge in Arctic regions and in mountains, and that's why I think your experience working there really fits very nicely with the course. Also because I understand you, even though you're not from Canada, you do live in Canada, and you have a lot of stories, I guess, to tell on the interaction with the people that you work with during your research. Not much more to say, I guess, from my side. I'm looking forward to your presentation, and I'm looking forward to the questions that the students may have. I understand during the lecture is fine for you as well, but then, of course, whoever has questions that come up and that they want to think about, they can also ask at the very end. There should be time to ask questions at the end of the presentation. Thanks so much, Anna, again. I'm going to turn off my audio, and I'm going to click the slides whenever you need me to.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Inka. Thank you, Jakob, for the invitation. I always like to chat about my research. You can bet on academics to love to chat about research. So thank you for having me over. So as you can see from the title of the lecture is Peopling Arctic Research. Since you have already been over the theory of indigenous knowledge, of local knowledge, this is more a story of theory in practice. Arctic research is quite often thought through the lens of natural resources or natural sciences or hard sciences, where locals are either consulted or are leading the research project. But there is also a very strong and growing research on the peoples that inhabit this Arctic. So indigenous peoples, new and old immigrants to the Arctic, seasonal workers, and also people like me, researchers. So this lecture is a bit more of a conversation with you and more of a storytelling of how I got interested in Arctic research and how I entered the field. I will also be asking questions to you as a way to extract Arctic research from this closed niche research area and instead think of it as a story about people in an interconnected world. Next slide, please. So this is a map from CAF, the Conservation of Arctic Flora and Fauna, which is a working group of the Arctic Council. And they have an amazing repository of mini maps on many different topics. It's honestly a great resource to check out. So yeah, I'm putting it here. So the first question, and you don't need to say it out loud if you don't want to, but you can just raise your hand. Has anybody actually been to the Arctic? So I know, Jakob, you do research in the Arctic, so that's for sure, but nobody else has been to the Arctic. Okay, that is great to know because that will kind of guide how I continue the lecture. So amazing to know. Even though you've never been to the Arctic, has anybody, and again, just a little hand is fine, has anybody have experience of going on field work, like at all, research field work in person? No. Oh, okay. Amazing. Right. Great. Um, so amazing. I love this. So a little introduction, I guess, to the Arctic. There are, as you can see from the map, many, many different people that live in the Arctic. Many, many different cultures, many, many different languages spread over immense territories. If you've done a little bit of work already in your course about Arctic peoples, you know just how immense the territories are. So for instance, if you can look at this, there's a little island that is in blue, and that is the territory of Nunavut. That also have the island on top, right on top of Greenland here. That portion, only that portion, is about 2 million square kilometers. So it is huge. It is a huge, huge, huge land area. And so as you can see with this quite large land area, there are some things, some consideration to keep in mind when you do research, when you do fieldwork in the Arctic. And one of them is accessibility. So how do you get there? In Nunavut, for instance, there are no roads. There are also no roads in Greenland, for instance. So how do you get places? Well, for instance, if I want to go to the north of Quebec, which is called Nunavik, if I want to go there, it will, from Montreal, it will cost me about $4,000 for one plane ticket to get up north. Lodgings, so like hotels, can also be very, very expensive. You're looking at from $200 to $400 a night. So when you do research in the Arctic, these are some of the logistics that you need to keep in mind, you as a researcher, either as a PI, like a primary investigator, or you as a student as well. In Nunavut specifically, we have the Nunavut Research Institute, which because they were aware of these, well, these logistical concerns that some researchers have, they made available some lodgings for researchers that are like a fraction of the cost. And these lodgings are in a few communities in Nunavut, which, because these lodgings are cheaper, that also focuses research in these particular communities. And that can lead to research fatigue, especially in Iqaluit, which is the capital of Nunavut. I'll get back to this notion of research fatigue, but I thought of introducing it here to kind of spark for you a little bit of already a bit of thinking about the ethics of doing research in communities, which we will talk about throughout this lecture.
Can I just add on that, because thank you so much for using the word research fatigue, because we used an example of that. I did not use the very apt term research fatigue. So they just to let the students know, the example that I gave you before of the woman who was getting annoyed because so many research groups were going in this one valley.
Yeah.
They were all asking questions, but nobody was coming with solutions. This would also be exactly in a very different context. And I think you're going to talk about this in more detail, but just to make the link, what that could be, and yeah, unfortunately, I did not use the word, but research fatigue is a great term. Thanks. We talked about
Yeah,
this.
thanks for bringing that up. I started my talk by saying like to extrapolate Arctic research from this niche little topic and to relate it to the wider realm of research in an interconnected world, of people in an interconnected world. The issues that we see in the Arctic, some are unique, but some are also not unique at all. And research fatigue and the ethics of doing fieldwork is something that is really global. Every single community has thought or talked about the ethics of research in their own communities. So I will go again, this is just like a little sneak peek into it, and we'll talk a little bit more about it in the following slides. Next slide, please. Thank you. This is Iqaluit. This is a picture of Iqaluit on top of a little hill. So Iqaluit is built on a hill. right before the rock formation, I'm not a geologist, so right before where you see um, the power plant that you can see right there in the back, these are not power plant. These are where where gas is stored. Right before that, you see like quite a bit of ice. Well, that's water, that's frozen water. So that is Iqaluit is quite a bit larger than this, but I think that it summarizes quite well what the city is about. There is a school, there's a supermarket, there are houses, there are buildings. It's a city, right? I did my fieldwork in Iqaluit in April 2024. And as you saw from the previous map, there are many languages, right, in the Arctic. In Iqaluit, that will be Inuktitut, specifically the Kikiktalut South Baffin dialect. A section of my research is on how Inuit knowledge, which includes concept in Inuktitut, is operationalized. And that also includes their translation into English and how that influences relations with the federal government. There are many different fields that look directly at these linguistic questions, like linguistic sociology. But what I was more interested in was this almost political philosophical questioning of what it means to think of sustainable development in the Arctic. I chose to look at this question through the specific lens of the development of renewable energy infrastructures, how these infrastructures are the representation of this larger push towards sustainability and how that translates in an Inuit context from questions of governance to questions of epistemology. A question to you, which is this time an open question, but if you're not feeling comfortable having your mic on, you can also just put it in the chat. And all of these questions, they're not for now. You can think about them and then answer just later on in the chat, and we can also get back to them during our Q&A at the end as well. My question regarding that is, are you aware of renewable energy in your neighborhoods? What do you think about them? And do you also think that your city governing bodies, so your elected officials, do you think that they listen to you when it comes to the development of energy for your communities? So unless someone wants to talk, feel free to think about it. Feel free to just put it in the chat, and we can get back to these answers during our Q&A later. Next slide, please.
I mean, I guess for Tübingen especially has I guess the most famous mayor in Germany with from the Greens. No, I don't know if he's still there, but it's the city is famous for that. That's what I knew about it. So I could imagine that there is some discussion of renewables in Tübingen as well. But I can also imagine that it's very, very different from the situation that you have in the Arctic.
Oh, that's super interesting. Yeah, for sure. Like the development of renewables in the Arctic, they face quite some unique challenges from an environmental perspective, but also from a scale perspective. But those challenges, for instance, I'm pretty sure um, that you can relate to them, for instance, in a third pole context like the Himalayas, where remote communities in quite difficult environment to think of energy solutions requires a holistic perspective on what is best for those particular communities. And that comes through centering voice, centering agency. What do communities want for themselves? I will get back to this notion of governance and sovereignty, self-determination. There are many words to talk about it, and I will get back to it. Thanks for that. I didn't know that Tübingen was so well known for its renewables project. So I'm actually looking forward to, yeah, dig a little bit deeper in that. So as I continue with my field work, I end up walking around and get a sense of how people live in the city. What does their commute to the grocery store looks like? What kind of foods can you get at what price? What do the roads look like? Are there playgrounds for kids around? Where are the kids? What about animals, wildlife, but also pets? Spoiler alerts, there are many, many dogs in Iqaluit. Dogs are a big favorite. Walking around when you do social science research helps to understand what stands out in a place. It helps you understand the lives, the daily lives of people. For instance, what stood out to me was in Iqaluit was, first of all, the hum of the generators, the very colorful houses, as you can see here, the surprising daily traffic jams at an intersection downtown. I was not expecting traffic jams in a city of 7,000 inhabitants. The dogs running around town also stood out to me. And, which I think is not to be ignored, the absolute stunning beauty of the horizon, of the environment. That is what kind of stood out to me. So my family is from a small town, so I also felt very comfortable there. While technically being a small town, like I mentioned, about 7,000 inhabitants, it honestly felt like an international city to me because it is. Iqaluit is the capital city of Nunavut, with government offices, Inuit organization offices, Canadian workers from all over Canada, but also international workers that came to work in Iqaluit. Iqaluit stands out in Nunavut because it's the capital, which is why when you do research in an Arctic community, whichever it may be, you've done research in one Arctic community. Each and every community is different, which I think you can also relate to. One town to the next where you're from, you will also notice differences, right? For instance, my hometown, Morlaix, has very, very little to do with Paris, the capital city of the country where I'm from. Even from town to town, Morlaix on the northern coast is different from Quimper, which is on the southern coast. Where my father is from, the Netherlands in Drenthe, my uncle used to tell me that from my dad's village to his village, there were already some dialectical differences, even though we're looking at very small differences, like 20, 30 kilometers. So when doing research in a community that is not your own, it's easy to generalize from the data that you're witnessing, that you're collecting. It's important to resist that urge because people are people in all their complexities, in all the ways that people are forever changing. And understanding this dynamic is fundamental in social sciences and humanities. People are complex and people change. Communities are complex and communities also change. Even from the time that I did my field work, things have changed. It's been a year, almost a year. This is where humility as a researcher is so important. You are external to the community that you're doing research in. And so it's important to be mindful of your positionality and the limitations of the data that you're collecting. That's scientific honesty. That's ethics. Do you know what positionality is? So positionality is a concept that was developed in relation to the ethics of researching in a community. It is understanding how you as an individual, you are yourself, that's true, you're complex, but that means that you also come with your whole baggage in a social context where who you are will influence the way that you are perceived by the other. So, for instance, I am a woman, I am white, and I am highly educated, which means that when I go into a community, that community will have preconceived notions about me. And at the same time, because I am external to the community, I will also have preconceived notions about them, perhaps, but also preconceived notions of how to interact with another person, cultural codes, What kind of cultural codes have I learned growing up that influences the way that I will talk to this other person? So positionality is who you are within a particular context, is your position. It is a political concept. Can also be argued a philosophical concept. You are what society makes you, but you're also someone that makes society because you perceive society. So that is what positionality is. And that is also something that is important to keep in mind when doing research, because who you are will influence the way that you understand, that you perceive, and therefore that you analyze the data that you are collecting, that you're looking at. And again, that comes back to this notion of scientific honesty, of ethics of doing research in communities. You need to be honest about the data you're collecting, about the limitations of your research. And in social sciences, especially when you're doing really that people-to-people research, it's important to put that out there, to be honest and explicit about those things. Next slide, please. So that's a picture of me when I was communicating some of my research findings and reflections during a meeting that was called the Arctic Remote Energy Network Academy, that was hosted in Iqaluit, where people from both Northern Canada and Alaska came to Iqaluit to learn more about its energy system. Some people who had participated in the research when I did my fieldwork in 2024 were also present. And so I used that opportunity to communicate some of the results of the research. So to go back to this idea of research fatigue. Research fatigue is fueled by, among others, the lack of transparency and accountability of Southern researchers that go to the North and then just honestly disappear. They never share the results of the research. Data sovereignty is a massive issue and a massive goal for many Indigenous communities and nations around the world. And as the Arctic is becoming the focus of international actors like the US and China, self-determination of Arctic nations, and in this case, Nunavummiut, so the inhabitants of Nunavut, is paramount. There are several domestic and international frameworks which protects Indigenous rights, such as the Canadian Constitution and UNDRIP, the UN Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The question is not that. The question is how to not only safeguard those rights, but to also realize those rights, to actually make self-determination a reality. That's a very, very large question that encompasses so many things. But as a researcher on my scale, I look specifically at data sovereignty and community engagement. The way that I do research is informed by the ethical standards as specified by the Nunavut Research Institute, which includes things like research results communication and consent forms. These are minimum standards, and regulating bodies such as the NRI, the Nunavut Research Institute, are fundamental to the future of research in the area. Research and researchers have a very long history of abusive practices in the North, from data theft to misrepresentations to abusive labor conditions and so on. And so in order for a new relationship to be constructed with local communities in the North, there is a need for actual regulations and for data sovereignty, for the protection of the data being produced. Without the ethics approval of the NRI, you can't do research in Nunavut. That's very, very important. To heal the damage that Southern researchers have done, there needs to be sovereignty of the North to determine the rules of the game. So an example of that is when I did my master's field work, and that was in 2018, 2019, that from my university in the Netherlands, I did not need to go through an ethical process. I didn't have to. It was only when I arrived to Canada that, because I was doing research with Indigenous communities, then I had to undergo a specific ethics review. I did not have to do that in the Netherlands. So what do you, again, this is a question. If you don't feel comfortable to talk out loud, feel free to put it in the chat. And again, we can come back to it during our Q&A as well. But what do you think about that, about those ethics reviews? Have you actually, you yourself, have you ever had to do an ethics for whatever project you may have done in the past? Are you aware of research protocols in place for where you are from? So if someone, for instance, from, I don't know, Latvia, wanted to come to Germany or wherever you are from and do research in your community, are you aware of them having to go through an ethics review process? I'm talking here about the North. I'm talking here about the Arctic. But these questions of data sovereignty and these questions of ethics of research, they apply globally, and they also apply to us. They apply to the communities that we are from as well. So while I'm talking here in a very specific colonial context of Nunavut, I also urge you to think about those questions for your own communities to, reflect about the ethics of research as well. I think, Jakob, you undid your mic for a second.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine that many of the students who are in the course, if anyone has experience, please do say so. And like Anna said, you can say that afterwards as well. But at this stage in a master's course, I can imagine that you don't have so much experience yet yourself. But I think what Anna has just mentioned is really, really important to see in the context of some of it we have already discussed, some we'll do tomorrow, that this is well, you mentioned it, Netherlands versus Canada. This is a luxurious position in a way, or it's a very restrictive position in a way, positively speaking, from the Canadian side. This is really not the standard that we see elsewhere, right? So from my own experience, Inka can perhaps say something as well. She has worked in many, many more places than I have research-wise. I have never, ever gone through any ethics review in my career. Not in Central Asia, not in China, not in Nepal, not in Pakistan, not from the European institutions, whether that is universities or companies, nor from any local institutions. In our Asia, the concept, the discussion around it exists to a very, very, very small degree. It exists more in the social sciences, but there is also no protocol in the social sciences. There is an ethics understanding that people adhere to because they think we should adhere to it, but not because anyone is actually checking it or enforcing it. In our side, on the more interdisciplinary natural sciences, nothing. I can go in any of these countries and do whatever I want, as long as I don't break the national law. But nobody checks. And my university, so in the Netherlands, when I did research from the Netherlands, the one thing they cared about in Nepal was that we had a permit to work in a national park, because we do our research to some degree in a national park in Nepal, and they wanted to see that we get an entry permit to work in a national park, which does not relate to the people who live in the national park, which are many, but it relates to the legal requirements that legally in Nepal you need, or globally, if you want to work in national parks, you need to have a research permit. And that the Dutch government wanted to see. They were not interested whether we had any, when we talked to local communities, whether we had any consent, absent.
Okay.
So just also for the students, perhaps to give context, I think, so this is fantastic that you're talking about this from the Canadian point of view. I think this is what we could aim for everywhere, but and we should learn from, but we are far away, I think. I don't know, Inka, if you have other examples from elsewhere. In Antarctica, there is probably stricter, but they're
Well, they don't
hardly
have so
people.
much indigenous knowledge in Antarctica, but you're right, it's even stricter there in terms of the permits that you need to get. So in terms of guarding nature's rights and ensuring that there everything is adhered to, I'm very used to following labyrinths of permits. But the only time I ever came across ethics was when I did my PhD in New Zealand, where I was in a department of geography where there was also a lot of social research going on. And I see there's quite a separation here, depending on which hat you have on, whether you're a social researcher or a natural science researcher, which shouldn't quite be the case. So maybe that's a loophole, Jakob.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting that you mentioned this divide between social science and natural sciences, because in the context of Nunavut, doing natural science research is actually more stringent with its ethics protocols than social sciences, because nature is so important for on so many different levels in the north, from honestly food security to cultural and philosophical, cultural practices as well. If you want to do research, for instance, on animals, there's a very long ethics approval process and negotiation, specifically with the Hunters Association. So it is that's something that is quite interesting in this way. And I'm happy that you brought that up. There is, yeah, when we talk about the Arctic, of course, is within this wider realm of polar research, also with Antarctica. And this is where there is a lot of discussion about having, in similarly to an Antarctic treaty, to have an Arctic treaty. And what would that mean? Not only what would that mean for sovereignty for people of the North, but also what would that mean for us as researchers who are not from the Arctic, but that would like to do research in the Arctic? How would that change? And also when in regards to the responsibility of governments in the North. So lots and lots of interesting questions, and I'm happy that you brought that up to make that parallel with Antarctica. And when it comes to New Zealand, this is where, from an indigenous sovereignty perspective, that's where it becomes really, really interesting. Where efforts that are done in Australia, in New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, other places in the world, also South America, when in regards to indigenous rights and nature's rights, where then in the north, there are also these discussions happening at the same time. So thank you for bringing that up. This is a whole other can of worms that I'm not going to get into, also because I'm not a specialist of New Zealand and Australia. I've never been there. But thanks for bringing that up. And I do urge students that are more interested about this question of Indigenous rights, of Indigenous sovereignty, to also look at the work being done by, for instance, the Maori. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up. And yeah, what are some specific things you did in your research to be transparent or protect people's data? So the first one, that's an amazing question. And it's an amazing question because it's is quite contextualized within I'm doing research in a small community where everybody knows each other. So how do I go about protecting people's data when everybody knows about everybody? So first of all, the question of anonymity. While I cannot, in good conscience, say that nobody will ever know that a specific person from this community talked to me. While I cannot protect that, I can say that they will not be identifiable in my research. So instead, for instance, of saying, oh, you work in this specific department, I will say, oh, you work for an Inuit organization. There are many, many Inuit organizations. So it's the little things. It's from an anonymity perspective, that's how I go about it. From a wider, then there are like the technical stuff, like for instance, making sure that your computer is secured, these kinds of things, right? But I think we're all aware of those. And when it comes to transparency, that's a great question. So for instance, when I went and presented the research at ARENA, at the meeting that the picture on here of the slide is of, that's one way to be transparent about the data. Another thing that is very important is translating. So every single time I did an interview, I would ask people, I would be like, do you want to receive the translation and the executive summary of the research? Because nobody is going to read my thesis, let's be honest here. They will, however, read the executive summary, which is a page long. Do they want to have that? And do they want to translate it into Inuktitut? If they say yes, I will provide that to them. I will also provide the executive summary on the Facebook group of the community. Facebook is the main mode of communication in many Arctic communities. And so that is something that I will do because I've had local inhabitants participate in the project and I don't have their emails. I will just share the executive summary on the Facebook group because that's also transparency. So I do think that there is a lot that can be done regarding transparency, especially from a student perspective and also about data sovereignty, again, as a student perspective. These are the small things that I can do to, support that transparency and the protection of people's data. That's a conversation to be continued always. This is how I go about it. And these are the things that I go about it also because that's part of the ethics approval. Like I don't have a choice here. That's part of, in order for the NRI to give you permission to do research, you need to have those things in place. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. Don't hesitate to bounce back if not. Next slide, please. So this is honestly my favorite thing I've seen in Iqaluit. Beach, gas, bar. Honestly, what else do you need in life? I love it. So this concludes the formal portion of my presentation about this conversation and what I wanted to share here about how I understand and view research in the Arctic, as well as how I position myself in this. I'm not from the Arctic, I'm not even from Canada, and that influences the ways that I encounter the research. Some cultural codes are very different, and fieldwork is honestly a huge learning curve, and that is what makes it interesting too. I fundamentally believe that research needs to be for the good of the people, not necessarily the greater good, but as a response to needs, wants, and to foster love and together living. This is how I view my own research as well, even outside of my doctoral work. I publish on colonial violence and on Inuit governance within this broader colonial context. And I publish on these topics for a very simple reason, honestly. It's not fair. Colonialism is not fair. So from that point on, what can I do? What can I contribute against that unfairness, against that injustice? There is a lot of responsibility as a researcher, and I shared these in the previous slide. And it is important to actively engage with those ethical discussions and considerations. This is an evolving process and an active process. And yeah, honestly, I'm very much looking forward to how these discussions are going to evolve for other parts of the Arctic, for instance, northern Quebec, Nunavut, and Greenland, among others. So thank you for listening and looking forward to your questions and to continue that discussion.